Let me invite you to open up your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We are continuing this morning in a series of lessons through the book of 1 Corinthians, and we are doing that with the lens of the subject of unity as our theme for the year. And as we come to the 5th chapter of 1 Corinthians, you might say, well, this is not the chapter about unity, but rather about division. I would say that, in fact, this, as much as any other, and maybe more so, is, in fact, about unity. And that without the teaching of chapter 5, unity will inevitably break down. And that's not just true of God's people, that's true of any people. You have to determine where the boundaries are. In any organization, any institution, you have to determine what it means to be a part and what it means to not be a part. What is a violation of those boundaries? Otherwise, you don't actually have an organization. You just have a nondescript grouping of people at a given time and place. So it gives definition. It gives definition to the unity. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, if you're not aware, is the chapter where Paul deals with an issue of immorality among the church at Corinth and is telling them what to do about it. I want to, as I say, consider how this deals with unity and then what we can learn from that today. Incidentally, I'll go ahead and tell you, I do have scheduled a couple of more lessons on the subject of withdrawal. One of those lessons would be more like procedural. What does that look like? How do we go about that? And then another lesson about restitution. How do we come back together after withdrawal? And so those will be dealing maybe with more than we'll deal with this morning in this particular text. As we open up chapter 5, Paul says, it is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and sexual immorality of such a kind as does not exist even among the Gentiles, that someone has his father's wife. And you have become puffed up, and have not mourned instead, so that the one who has done this deed would be removed from your midst. I want to talk to begin with about the idea of pride in this passage. Pride, first of all, is an issue throughout the letter to the Corinthians. In fact, this word only shows up in the letter to the 1 Corinthians and then one other place in Colossians. And so a number of times Paul brings up this word that's translated puffed up or arrogant. Some of your translations may have. Back beginning in chapter 4 and in verse 6, it says, these things, brothers, I have applied to myself and Apollos for your sake, so that in us you may learn not to go beyond what is written, so that no one of you will become puffed up on behalf of one against the other. Again, down in verse 18 of the same chapter, now some have become puffed up, as though I were not coming to you. But I will come to you soon, if the Lord wills, and I shall know not the words of those who are puffed up, not the words of those who are puffed up, but their power. And so Paul is pressing against the arrogance that is really against him. And I think chapter 5 is one of the ways in which that arrogance is bearing out in behavior. He goes on in chapter 8 as he begins to warn against the maybe nonchalance with which they're handling the things offered to idols. He says, concerning things offered to idols, we know that all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And then again in chapter 13, of course, as he's describing love, he says, love is not this. Love is not puffed up. So how are they being puffed up in relation to this situation? Well, they're ignoring obvious sin, which takes a particular degree of arrogance. To take the approach they're taking, they have to believe certain things that are, I think, rooted in pride and arrogance. Notice he says there again in chapter 5, 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 1, that this sin is not even named among the Gentiles. It's a degree of sexual immorality that goes beyond even societal norms, right? So we live in a culture with rampant sexual immorality. So did they. And yet, Paul says this is not even that kind of sexual immorality that would be all around them in Corinth. It's the kind that even Corinthians would say, what is wrong with you? And so that's the level that this has risen to. He says in verse 3, for I on my part, though absent in the body but present in spirit, have already judged him who has committed this as though I were present. It's so obvious and so heinous that Paul says, I don't even need to be there to make a judgment. It's not, there are sins that are present, or let's say maybe present, but require some thinking through, some sort of conversation. Is this sin, or is this maybe just poor judgment? This is not that. This is so bad that Gentiles would say, yep, that's a sin. We don't even believe in your God, but we know that's a sin. It's so heinous that Paul says, I don't even have to be there. Just hearing about this is enough for me to go, yes, there's no extenuating circumstances that would make this okay. There's no conversation that could put this into an area of judgment. This is absolutely sin. So how does that correlate to being puffed up? I think it is a pride. I think, though, it's the pride, the sort of pride that may be harder to see. In Luke chapter 18 and verse 9, you're familiar with the story of the Pharisee that Jesus tells, who comes in to pray, to the temple to pray, and as he's praying, there is a penitent tax collector. And I think that's important. It's not just a tax collector. It would be bad enough to hear his language on, if he were pointing to a tax collector in the distance. He's pointing to a tax collector who is prostrating himself, repenting before God, and says, I think I'm not like that guy. And of course, the message at the end of Jesus' story is, you ought to be like that guy, the one who is humbled before God. That's the sort of pride that, like, obviously, nobody wants to be that. And people always position pride in this place. But there's a pride that looks at sin. And when it sees sin, it doesn't do what the Pharisee does. It doesn't say, oh, I'm so thankful I'm not guilty of what that guy's guilty of. There's a pride that looks at sin and says, this is okay. I can work with this. Everybody else may reject this person, but I don't. Because I am gracious and merciful. And in fact, I'm more gracious and merciful than all of you people. And what they don't say, but what they imply without knowing it, is that they are more gracious than God himself, who says he will have nothing to do with this person. This is the problem, I think, in the case of Jehoshaphat. And in the case of Jehoshaphat, you recall his friendship, his alliance, his repeated going back to and allying himself with Ahab and the family of Ahab. And we're told in 2 Chronicles chapter 19 and verse 2 that Jehu, the son of Hanani, the seer, went out to meet him to his face and said to King Jehoshaphat, should you help the wicked and love those who hate Yahweh, and so bring wrath on yourself from Yahweh? This is a pride that is coupled with or even cloaked in righteousness. Jehoshaphat is not thoroughly wicked in the same way Ahab is. But he is at fault, and he is guilty, and he is to be condemned in this passage because he loves those who are wicked more than he loves God. And because he is willing to put his kingdom and the righteous people and his own family at risk because he thinks he knows better than God. This is a pride where people think, I can help where you can't. You just go to rejection. You're just that disciplinary model, but I just send them to me. I can do something with them. And I think this in a number of different ways that we do this. There are places where congregations, they withdraw from somebody, and another congregation exhibits this very kind of pride. we can deal with them. We can handle them. That congregation over there, they just didn't have enough patience, but we do. So you come here and you'll find opening arms, even though they've rejected you over in that congregation. I think this when people come into questioning other people's parenting. So a kid comes to you, and I've told parents here, when I'm talking to your children, I will never question your judgment unless it is radically out of order with God's will. And I will check with you first to see if that's what happened, because I won't take your kid's word over you. And so people will say to that child who's running away from discipline, oh, I know how your parents, you will not hear that from me. I'm going to support the discipline that is being laid on the child. And so we have to be very careful that we do not puff ourselves up, that we do not pride ourselves in thinking that we know better, and most especially that we know better than God. I believe that the first kind of pride is what's most often preached about, and it's certainly a problem, and it's something to be avoided. But culturally, don't you think we're guilty of the second kind of pride more often in the society we live in? Where society says we can be more gracious and we can help people even though other people have rejected them. And don't you think that it has led to just as much or more chaos than the first kind of pride? When judges, for instance, have the pride to look down upon a criminal who has committed heinous acts and think that they somehow have more wisdom than God Almighty in extending mercy where God has not told them to extend mercy. And they have created a great deal of chaos through that pride. So, this is the nature of their being puffed up. It's a dangerous pride, and it's one that's every bit as dangerous, and in some ways even more dangerous than the typical kind of pride that we look at. Well, moving on through the text then, he makes this accusation of pride and involving this particularly egregious sin. He then moves into what they ought to do, and he makes reference here to the Old Testament that we'll look at in just a moment. He says, I, for my part, as we already read, though absent in body, present in spirit, have already judged him who's committed this sin as though I were present. And so he tells them, in the name of the Lord Jesus, when you are assembled, and I with you in spirit, with the power of our Lord Jesus, deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, was sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and in truth. I want to say, first of all, picking up there in verse 3 and moving into this instruction, what Paul is calling them to do is to follow the judgment that he himself has already made at a personal level. A lot of times what will happen in discussions of withdrawal is people talk about it only at the congregational level. But notice, even in this passage where the congregation is being instructed to make the withdrawal, it is rooted, or it begins, the instruction begins in what Paul says he has already done. And this is backed up by what Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and in verse 20. It says, among these are Hymenaeus and Alexander. This is those who have made a shipwreck with regards to their faith in verse 19. He says, among these are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan so that they will be taught not to blaspheme. It's the same language as what we see here delivered to Satan. And it's the language of Paul saying, I have done this. I handed them over. Not they were withdrawn from by the congregation to which they belong, but I did this. Now, what if Corinth doesn't obey Paul? I gather that Paul himself is still going to have nothing to do with this man. Right? He's not going to go, oh, well, I guess he's still a part. No, he's saying, I'm telling you, you need to do publicly what any sane person has already done on their own. What I can do all the way over here where I'm at, I can see and I can make a conclusion here. Y'all need to do it there. So they need to follow the lead of Paul, not the other way around. Not Paul waiting on them to make a decision for him to then decide what he's going to do. I think what happens here is some sort of a really pharisaical kind of a loophole. Somebody is clearly living in sin, has rejected God, and their family member or friend says, well, they weren't withdrawn from. Yeah, but maybe you could start that. Maybe you're the first line of defense. I remember on one occasion, a congregation that we were a part of, and a woman, an older woman, was leaving the Lord. And there was a lot of conversation about it, but nothing was being done about it. And I remember her son, who was an older man who usually didn't attend business meetings. He had had some bad experiences there, and nevertheless, he came to a business meeting. And what are you doing here? And he says, I want to know what y'all are going to do about my mom. This guy was like in his 50s or 60s. And they were like, well, it's kind of a tricky situation. He says, we're over here trying to hold the line, and we'd like some backup. He had already decided. He said, we know what's going on. And the church was tiptoeing around because they were afraid of what the family might think. Well, I'll tell you what the family might think. The family might think, where are you? Why are you helping us out here? Because we're trying to get my mother back. And so it shouldn't be either one really waiting on the other. If a congregation can see, a congregation ought to act. If an individual can see, an individual ought to act. And they ought to be encouraging the other to do the right thing. And so Paul here starts from that premise and says, follow me, do what I'm already doing. Well, then he points to the Passover as a pattern. As you look back at this pattern that he points to in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 15, you see the context there when he says remove the leaven. In Exodus 12 and verse 15, as the Passover is being instituted, it says 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, but on the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats anything leavened from the first day until the seventh, that person shall be cut off from Israel. So the instruction, you see how excuse the pun, how sweeping it is, because they were supposed to sweep out the leaven. But how far-reaching it is. It's total. It doesn't just say don't eat any leaven. It says get rid of all of the leaven. Make sure there is none even in the house. And I believe in that case, as it follows there, it says do this because anybody who eats anything leavened during this time will be cut off. The idea is if you leave something leavened in the house, what's going to happen? You're going to eat some of it. You're going to partake, and so get it out. Get it far from you. Then the idea here, of course, is the idea of leaven in an actual loaf. A little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump. The idea is that you can't leave this around. It spreads out and it affects things. And so either it's don't leave it leaven in the house because that's going to tempt you and you're going to eat it, or don't leave leaven in the house because it's going to get into things it's not supposed to, and you won't be able to stop it. Well, I think that's the idea, isn't it? You got to get this out. Because once you say it's okay to have this man who's sleeping with his father's wife, you cannot stop the consequences of that. You don't get to draw the lines anymore. When somebody does something, and here's one of the things I think we need to understand, and I'll come back to this point, everybody draws a line somewhere. But when you don't draw the line here, your lines don't mean anything anymore. And this happens a lot too, where sometimes a congregation, they're not very active in applying church discipline, but some case will come along and it's like, okay, well here, that's enough. And so they decide we're going to practice church discipline. And what do they hear in response? Why me? What about that one and that one and that one? Well, their family, or we We didn't think it rose to this level. Are they in sin or not? Are they living in sin? Have they rejected the Lord? And if they are, then we have to consistently apply that pattern. I remember 25 years ago when I was just getting started preaching, hearing about a case where a congregation withdrew from somebody and that person sued the congregation. And the very basis of that lawsuit was you have applied the status, you've applied this edict precariously. And you've not been consistent along the way. And he won the lawsuit. And I don't think he was wrong. He was wrong to sue them. But I don't think he was wrong in his accusation. And he was able to show that there were a number of people whose sin they had let pass. And so that's inevitable. It's going to happen. If you let some sin pass, you will let other sins pass. The Passover shows that if you do not remove leaven, you will be affected by it. You will partake. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 1 through 12 teaches a similar lesson as Paul points back to the Israelites and says, look at them. They went through the same spiritual baptism, ate the same spiritual food, drank the same spiritual water, and look at what happened to them. They got too close. They did not keep themselves separated from idolatry, and there they are, bodies scattered in the wilderness. So, make this thorough. Now, I think that should already increase the gravity of the situation. By likening to this element of leaven that was supposed to be completely removed. But another aspect of this, and I talked about this not too long ago, towards the end of last year in a lesson, the correlation between what God calls his people to do in Deuteronomy 13 and what God calls his people to do in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. In Deuteronomy chapter 13, there is a false prophet or dreamer of dreams who gives a sign or wonder. There in verse 1, it says, the sign or wonder comes true concerning which he spoke, saying, let us walk after other gods whom you have not known, and let us serve them. So even if the sign comes true, but he says, let's go serve other gods, you don't have anything to do with that guy. You shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for Yahweh your God is testing you to find out if you love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul. And you shall walk after Yahweh your God and fear him. And he says that prophet or dreamer of dreams shall be put to death because he has counseled rebellion. But then in verse 6, it says, if your brother, your mother's son, or your son or daughter, or the wife you cherish, or your friend who is as your own soul, entices you secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods whom neither you nor your fathers have known. If the gods of the peoples who are around you, near you or far off from you, from one end of the earth to the other end, you shall not be willing to accept him or listen to him, and your eye shall not pity him, and you shall not spare him or conceal him, but you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people. So you shall stone him to death, because he sought to drive you from Yahweh your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Well, that is as strong a commandment as you will find in the law. The idea of not just you shall not hide him or shield him from judgment, but you ought to be first in line. No pity, he says. Now I want to be careful, because we don't want to become pitiless people in general. But there is an order here. We talked about ordered love several weeks back. There's an ordered love here. I love God so much that someone pulling me away from him will fall into the category of hatred. And there will be no pity. And I cannot at all put that person in competition with my loyalty to God. Now, I think that everyone would have a line, or let me say most people, the vast majority of people would have a line over which if People, even in this category, your own brother, your own children, your wife, if they crossed over this line, you'd be done. I don't know what that is. And some people, there is no line, right? You see these people on TV and their son has committed some heinous act and my boy's a good boy and so forth. And you just, what would it take? But I tell you what you also see. Every once in a while, a story will come out. It happened with the shooter in the Charlie Kirk case, where you've got someone who's committed a heinous crime. And it's not that the parents don't love them, but they won't shield them from justice. And his father ended up being the one who actually turns him in. And what do people think about that? Well, a lot of people said, how could you do that? How could you do that to your son? Because you love something more than your son. There's something more important even than your own son, so that you would be the one to turn him in. I wonder what we think about that. What would you think about someone who had the death penalty, who their father had to be the one to administer the death penalty? If you had some kind of news story like that, I think that would not happen. If we still had hangings or we still had beheadings and he was the one with the axe, he was the one the man pulling the lever for the noose, I think we'd think pretty poorly of that guy. Culturally, I think we'd say, there's something wrong with a man that could do that to their own son. And yet God says, this is the attitude I want you to have. I want the willingness to be able to put to death the person that's closest to you in this life. And he does that with every category. Sibling. Okay, you pull the trigger. What if it's your child? You pull the trigger. What if it's your spouse? You pull the trigger. What if it's the closest friend you've ever had in the world? You pull the trigger. That's how far God goes. And then we come to 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and we wonder, how far does this go? I think it goes as far as God's always wanted it to go. Whoever it is. If it's somebody trying to pull you away from God, this is how we relate to them. Cut off. And I think the real problem is, for the most part, we take leaving the Lord as a sad but not necessarily heinous thing. Like, we're disappointed. Hate to see it. But we're not going to let it ruin a relationship. What do you mean? If somebody left the Lord, and I know this is incendiary. I mean, I understand it's emotional language. But if you found out that your brother was a pedophile, nobody would blame you for saying, look, till he repents, we just don't have anything to do with each other anymore. We're done. We are done. And everybody would say, yeah, that's right. That's the stand you should take. I realize I don't want to just put anybody leaving the Lord into the category. I understand there are physical differences. On this temporal plane, there are differences. But on the day of judgment, there's not. And so what we're saying is, you've left the Lord, and the Lord says, this is as bad as it gets. When they reject me, and especially if they try to convince you to reject me, we're done. And we can't have anything to do with each other anymore. God says we need to draw the line where he draws the line. Not just where we get fed up, but where he says this is the line that you cannot cross. Now, as Paul teaches this, he says this applies, of course, within the church. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, back there beginning in verse 9, picking up in verse 9, I wrote to you, he says, in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. I did not at all mean with sexually immoral people of this world, or with the greedy and swindlers, or with idolaters, for then you would have to go out of the world. But now I am writing to you not to associate with any so-called brother if he is a sexually immoral person, or greedy, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or a swindler. not even to eat with such a one. What have I to do with judging outsiders? Are you not to judge those who are within the church? But those who are outside, God will judge. Remove the wicked man from among yourselves. Obviously, this applies only in the church because that's the place where we have jurisdiction. I don't think, let me be clear, Paul is not saying, he's not saying we can make no judgment towards anything happening in the world. But he is saying that we make judgment where we have the authority and responsibility to make the judgment. We're talking about really regulating membership based on what is, I would say, known criteria. Every organization does this. And they all only act on or towards those who are members of the organization, right? So anybody who violates the terms of an organization is going to be excluded from that organization. Now, maybe there's a process, maybe there's warnings and so forth, but eventually you violate, you're going to be told you can't be a part of this group anymore. And nobody thinks anything of that. If you were a part of a ball team and you just stop showing up, like they might not hate you, they might, but they might not hate you, they may just say, you just can't be a part of the ball team. You don't come to practices, you don't come to the games, you're just not a part of this team anymore. And nobody would be like, how hateful. Everybody would be like, well, yeah, I mean, that just kind of makes sense. You can't be a part of what you refuse to be a part of, if you refuse to abide by the rules. If you won't do what the coach tells you to do, you're off the team, right? And most of us would support that and understand that's an inherent part of an organization. I do want to say this I want to make some comparisons, if you will, because what comes up sometimes in a discussion like this is that this is just another version of cancel culture. I've heard this lately. You know, you conservatives, you hate cancel culture, but that's exactly what's happening right here when you withdraw from people. First of all, I believe cancel culture isn't by itself, canceling is not the problem. It's who gets canceled, how they go about it, what they're being canceled for, and how to reconcile. In cultural cancel culture, the whole world is policed by internet busybodies. That's not what Paul's talking about. He's saying members who've all agreed to live by the same standards. We're not just going out there and withdrawing from people, you know, having that sort of interaction with people, just random people in the world. We're talking about our brethren in Christ. They get canceled then by public exposure without the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. You know, it's just scattershot approach. They get canceled for things that are not only not sin, but in fact for saying true things. So that's a real distinction to be made here. And the line for what you get canceled is always moving. You never know, one day to the next, what might get you canceled. And finally, there is no reconciliation for the cancel. You cannot apologize enough and you cannot make enough amends to be let back in to good graces with the people, with the culture that cancels you. The case for church discipline is, first of all, this is sin that is proven. It is by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. We do not go on hearsay, and we do not reject someone that we have a suspicion might have sinned. This is clear and proven sin. It is to those who claim to be of Christ, but are living contrary to the thing that they claim. And reconciliation is available, is not only available, it is the point. In cancel culture of the world, the point is you get no participation in society anymore. This is, we want you to participate, but you will not. And so we have to draw a line so that we hope, as Paul says, they may be one, that they can come back. That's the whole idea. And so, yes, it applies within the church, and that framework should be obvious and understandable. Some degree, therefore, of association with the world is necessary based on what Paul says here. You'd have to go out of the world. this doesn't mean that you have a pass to be best friends with worldly people. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14 through 18, Paul cautions against our association, not just cautions, but instructs against close and undue association and influence. And so he preaches distance there between ourselves and the world. It just means that living and working in this world requires some degree of association with people who are obviously not living by God's standards. So we make judgments where we have the responsibility to make judgments. Again, this doesn't mean we make no judgments about what's happening in the world. The judgment that is being talked about here is a judgment that comes, let's say, comes with a sentence. Right? You're administering judgment as a judge, and you're saying this is the consequence. Now you go to somebody and you say to maybe your coworker, you are living in sin. They say, well, you don't have a right to judge me. Well, I don't have a right to pass any sentence, right? I don't have a right to do anything about the fact that you're committing sin. But Paul is certainly not saying that you actually can't even say something sin out there. That's nonsense, and it goes against everything that he says, even in this very letter, much less his other writings. I would additionally say it doesn't mean that the world isn't, that's a double negative, I know. It doesn't mean that the world isn't subject to God's law, because this is another thing that people will say. They'll look at this and say, see, Paul says God's law doesn't apply to those people. That's not what he said. He said, you do not have administrative jurisdiction over people in the world. He does say God will judge them. By what law? Same law you're going to be judged by. Right? So they still, this separation, this distinction of inside the church and outside the church is more of an administrative distinction, relational distinction, rather than a distinction of what applies to who. Well, how does this bring us to unity? I'm going to tell you, understand that the world would tell you that what Corinth is doing, that Paul condemns them for, the world would say that is unity. Tolerance, acceptance, affirmation, this is the path to unity. But the reality is that no organization goes without drawing lines. Everyone draws lines somewhere. And the line that you have in places that act like Corinth ends up being against the one who's saying the truth. And again, isn't that our culture? Right? No, we don't draw lines anywhere. Well, I think that's sin. Okay, we draw one line. It's against you. So everybody draws the line somewhere. The unity here is not about whether we will disassociate with people. It is about, because everybody does that, it is about who will define the terms. The unity is in coming to agreement and saying we will draw lines where God draws lines. Theodore Roosevelt, as he's accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, said this. I love this. He's accepting a prize for peace. And he says, peace is generally good in itself, but it is never the highest good unless it comes as the handmaid of righteousness. I wish we had presidents that still talk like that. He understood that peace, unity, is not the highest good. It is something that is nested underneath a greater good. And righteousness is the greater good that unity comes under. And in fact, you can't have lasting peace, unity, without that righteousness. It is chaotic and it is shifting, and it will never be a unity that holds together unless it has the firm foundation of the righteousness of God. You can be at peace with God this morning and with his people by swearing allegiance to him and therefore becoming an enemy to all that wars against him. Unity with him means division against something else. The life of the Christian is not one of peace with any and everything and everybody. It is a life of peace with God. And his peace is accomplished through the strength of his righteousness, not through the surrender of any ground to sin or death. And so the invitation is for you this morning. Will you make peace with him? If there's anyone who could respond to that invitation, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?